went over the state of the Secure Boot implementation as exists in Ubuntu today, and as exists in Debian, which is kind of partial support, but not enough to actually do anything useful yet.
I'm going to create a document in Gabi under devconf 14 Bob.
Too late.
What is it called?
UEFI space Bob.
Okay. So there you go.
Rename it later if we can. Carry on.
So we didn't have, it's unfortunate we don't have FTP master representation here because that was a problem last time on as well. But we largely agreed that we were basically just going to clone the same general idea, namely we use latest shim, which is a system which Matthew can probably explain more about, but whose purpose is to be signed by an entity like Microsoft, essentially, and bootstraps our way into a better bootloader like Grub, which we can then bootstrap the rest of the system from. The Grub itself needs to be signed by a Debian key. So we need to do that, I think, on FTP master in order to have remotely acceptable security. To do that, we need to sort out key management so that because this is obviously an important point of attack. So we want to have it protected in more or less the same kinds of ways that we protect the key for the Debian archive itself.
So is it clear that an FTP team member walked into the room?
Oh, hello. It was not clear. That's very useful.
Hi, I'm an FTP assistant, so I'm not FTP master, but...
Excellent. Well, this can be your fault.
Oh, Jesus.
You can at least tell us whether we're confused about something about the...
Sure. Speak from my mail, so yes.
Yeah, right. Matthew.
Okay, so I'm just going to go over, since there's a bunch of people here, I'll quickly go over what shim does, what features it enables that are relevant to Debian, and a few things that need to be considered based on some changing requirements. So shim is an EFI executable, which is in a format that is accepted for signing by Microsoft. It performs one real function, which is to execute EFI executables that are signed with a key that is not in the firmware key database. So UEFI Secure Boot systems have a database of acceptable keys, and executable needs to be signed by keys in that database to be executed through the standard UEFI mechanisms. Shim exists to be signed by a third party who is already trusted by the platform, and then bridge that root of trust to a different root of trust. So the typical way of using it is for the vendor to ship shim signed by Microsoft or some other trusted third party, and then embed their key inside that. Any further binaries that are signed with that key, shim will perform its own validation, its own relocation, and will launch them independently of the firmware, so you don't need to go through the firmware key database. And in addition, shim also supports its own user-modifiable key database, so the end user can generate a signing key, install that in a standardized way that is consistent between different systems. It requires the user to be physically present. There's a point where it requires you to type in a confirmation phrase on a screen at the console. So it's designed to prevent it from being easy to socially engineer someone into installing arbitrary keys. Grub will then call into shim in order to verify the kernel, so you can then have a fully signed root of trust up to the point where you then use whatever additional root of trust you want. If you wanted to build something on top of this where you had a verified inner MFS and a verified root file system, you could do that. That's not required. As far as we're concerned, once user space starts, then the usual trust model is that user space is assumed to be trustworthy, whatever it is. There's no enforcement there. The other thing you can do with this key database is disable signature validation, which means that shim will launch anything you give it. Again, that requires physical presence. You run a command under Linux, you type in a password, you reboot, and then shim requires you to type in the same password again, and then asks you whether you want to disable signature enforcement. And from then on, it will boot any copy of Grub will boot any kernel, so the user has a standardized way to disable its enforcement.
Without disabling secure boot.
Without disabling secure boot entirely, so that means that you don't have to jump through whichever boots your particular platform vendor has implemented just in order to do kernel development or Grub development.
Which is quite a serious problem, because at present, while there are certain requirements on firmware, particularly from things like the Windows 8 certification guidelines on what you must make available, it says absolutely nothing about whether this be even slightly convenient.
Or whether you can figure out from the menu what it's called.
Right.
Unless you deeply understand Secure Boot, you're half the time unlikely to figure out which option relates to putting it in setup mode.
So the aim of all of this was to produce the least worst thing that still respected user freedoms. I think we came as close as is reasonably possible to get. The local key management stuff was implemented by SUSE originally. Most of the rest of it was implemented by Red Hat. The future stuff, there's not a great deal of additional work being done on shim in interesting technical ways at the moment. There's support for ARM has just been added. It also has support for 32-bit x86 if you have one of the tiny number of systems with Secure Boot and 32-bit UEFI firmware. It has support for being a fallback bootloader, where if you put it in a well-defined location, if the system loses all its boot entries, then shim will launch, re-enroll your boot entries, and then boot normally.
Also important for the systems that don't respect the specs requirements on where the bootloader is to be installed, fixed versus removable locations.
Yeah. So one thing is that Microsoft have recently modified their signing policy slightly. In order to sign up to Microsoft Signing Service, you now require an extended validation certificate. So in HTTP land, those are the ones where you get the big green thing in Firefox rather than just the little one that also gives you the name of the company you're talking to. That costs more money because it means somebody actually has to go to real efforts to verify your existence and identity.
But it's not a lot of money.
It also means you have to have a real existence and identity that's
Right.
verified.
So I think the cheapest that I've seen so far is on the order of $1,000 for a 3-year certificate. This is within Debian's realms, but is a little bit hostile to the individual end user.
That's the shit.
It also doesn't.
That's the
fit with
EV.
us
I mean,
signing
most
other
expensive.
keys with that.
Right, you can't sign other keys
Right.
with
You
that.
cannot
but
get a
that's-
CAEV cert.
But that's in itself not a problem. It's Microsoft originally requires that any embedded keys also be EV certs. It lacks that requirement.
Yes.
It's now perfectly accessible for you to generate your own key, but said key is supposed to be maintained in a FIPS-compliant hardware device. Now that sounds kind of terrifying, but FIPS-compliant hardware devices includes just Java smart cards. So that's not a particularly high hurdle to get over.
Well, if you're a crypto organization, then FIPS compliant usually means weaker than your
Yes.
thing.
So a real hardware security module is way beyond the FIPS requirements here. A smart card that plugs into a USB reader is completely acceptable. There also exist USB tokens that effectively present as smart cards.
Well, the thing that we're doing in Ubuntu is none of the above, but we do use GF splits. So we have 3 of 7 requirements on reconstructing our master secure boot key, which I don't know if it meets the letter of FIPS, but it is equivalent to Spirit.
So the other thing is that Microsoft have no way to verify this. It's because it's a key. They
Yes.
So
If
that's
you
really
publicise too much that you're not doing what you claim
you
to have
probably
done.
should not put that in the Etherpad.
It's not there now.
You probably also should not put anyway. It's a good thing nobody can hear this on the stream. But that's more a case of if you do somehow screw up, then there might be problems later, but just don't screw up.
So we have gotten informal, at least, approval from Microsoft for the key sharding that Colin
Yeah.
described. We haven't actually gone through the certification process since or the signing process since they did change their requirements due to some other issues regarding minimum version requirements for shim that we need to uplift to.
So the other thing in terms of shim development is a desire to move to shim's now moved to a model where the vendor certificate is stored in an additional section. It's not embedded in the code or data segment. There's a separate section within the executable that contains the certificate. This means that if we do the appropriate work to ensure reproducible builds, even if you receive a binary from Debian, you will be able to verify that the binary you build from the source code is identical to the one in Debian, with the exception of the certificates. You can verify that all the executable code is identical. This is for two purposes. First of all, it means that users can actually trust that Debian or Ubuntu or whoever are building the binaries from the same source code, and that if it is backdoored, it's backdoored in the toolchain.
Yeah, it's not backdoored by Microsoft.
Right. And secondly,
Well, you can check that in other ways by confirming that the signed object is
Yes.
and secondly, this is also, we hope, going to make life easier for Microsoft, because they'll be able to verify that the code's identical, and if a binary matches something they've already signed with the exception of the certificate, then it can go through a shortcut signing process.
This is not through some altruistic desire to make life easier for Microsoft in general. It's because the signing process can take months. So,
Or result in rejections if they simply don't.
Yeah. In terms of the long-term politics of Microsoft being the signing thing, then that's going to continue being a conversation for a long time. I can't really say anything more about that at the moment. That's not going to change in the immediate future. Nobody else has offered to take that role.
Have we seen anything that would suggest that they are not acting as a fair and honest custodian?
We have not seen anything to suggest that they are acting in their own interests as opposed to others.
there are ways in which they have been annoying in one way or another, but none of it
That's
appears
just
to be
cool. None of it appears to be
none of it
malicious.
appears to be malicious.
Yeah. They're a signing authority,
Yeah.
and they're a large company, so
They're
Expect something.
They're being consistent with us.
So there was a mention that we're going to need to start signing grub. How would this interact with if we wanted to start having UEFI stub Linux kernels that can be directly booted rather than using grub?
Right. So the way I designed this in Ubuntu permits both. Okay, so the state of the code in Debian today is as follows. Grub has a number of patches, mainly from Matthew/Red Hat, which cause it to behave in a sort of secure boot appropriate way when loaded as such. So, for instance, when the grub core image is signed, it will refuse to load any modules which are not in the core image, because that would amount to executing unsigned code in firmware context, which you're not allowed to do. As a result, we build a rather larger core image in the case of Secure Boot that has everything we need. All that code is in Debian. Some of it I think is configured off by default, but that's fairly trivial. We have code to build a custom upload, so the sort of thing that a handful of packages do to put things into rather odd places in the archive. For instance, DI builds a raw installer custom thing, which ends up being unpacked by a DAC into, or actually by hand script, I think, into installer dash thing somewhere under disks. That's we have the code to do something similar for UEFI. At that point, DAC would unpack the raw bootloader images into disks, Jesse, Min, UEFI, something or other, and also sign those with the SP sign tool and the FTP. I laid that out in the implementation I have today in Ubuntu in such a way that you can have different package, it's not just for grubs, so different packages could do the same thing. The kernel could emit, in fact probably should emit, an object for signing in much the same way. For that kind of thing to be sensible, it has to be entirely automated, really. It should not be something that requires manual action by FTP master, otherwise it's going to take all week.
But to answer another question that was possibly also what you're asking, shim does not care whether you're looking grub, the kernel, or any other valid UEFI executable. As long as it's signed with a trusted key, it'll launch it. You can tell shim to just launch the kernel directly instead of having shim launch grub.
Oh, sure. I was more concerned with, as we work toward trying to integrate UEFI direct boot into Debian, which I hope we do at some point.
I would really recommend not doing that.
No,
it requires you to put the inner MFS on the UEFI system partition. That's just a bad idea. Don't do it. It's horrible.
So, Colin,
I
just
can
to-
Let's
imagine
talk about that later.
Well, I can imagine it being useful in specific situations. I don't think it's a general purpose approach.
Just to clarify the, for this purpose of getting this working in Debian, you outlined at least a to-do being enabling that code for secure boot and grub. But were there other things that I should note down as things we need to actually concretely do to move
Right,
this
so I
forward?
asked a question on IRC to Colin, who I don't think looked at. We'll scroll back. I recall that we had a to-do list that somebody said was recorded somewhere. Can we refer back to that earlier document? What's the URL for that so we can grab that into the copy here?
Well, I sent in a mail, which was a summary of last year's assignment.
It was hooked again very recently with a link on Debian CD and a few other places. So
I guess it would be a shame if we spent most of the time on the session
Rehashing
moving
that, yeah,
forward,
yeah.
rehashing that and
Yeah.
describing what secure boot is and all those things.
Right, I'm just digging it out. Can we move on while various people try to find that?
That basically, basically, you want
Can you paste it into copy and
you want the content or the
the
link?
link is fine, thanks.
So the link is there. Everything else is there.
One thing I want to add regarding the state of the current code. At present, grub is configured to permit you to put on signed kernels. This has been, to say the least, controversial, but the reason for that is that the version of shim that has been in certainly Ubuntu and I think also to whatever extent it's in Debian, it does not have mock manager enabled, the machine owner key thing that Matthew was talking about a moment ago. Without that, if you require signed kernels, then the barrier to entry for testing new kernels, doing any kind of kernel development, etc., goes up very substantially. So we need mock to be in place before we can require signed kernels. Once we do, I'll be happy to revert that bit of grub, and then we will not be in a position where there are many trivial kernel exploits that will get our key removed.
So you're saying like the step 0 is get mock manager into this?
Well, we can do many other things in preparation, but step 0 in order to get to signed kernels is having mock manager, so we don't hinge unnecessarily on user freedom.
We have Ubuntu packaging that enables mock manager and it's just needs to get the developer version of shim for signing purposes, but any shim work in Debian is blocked on us having a Debian key put in it. So I think that's what we need to really be talking about, making sure it gets addressed.
Okay. So I do have, looking through Ben's mail, I do have some duck changes to support this. I could really use assistance with setting up a test environment, or if it's just easier to test in the production system today, then fine, that's not a problem.
I can help you with that. I did it with here recently.
Okay, thank you. I would like to grab you then this week, so
Yeah.
we can run through that. The other thing that is important there is that, as I said earlier, I think that this should run unattended. I would prefer not to effectively end up. I prefer that this run unattended where possible. I don't want to be in a situation where all grub uploads go through new, effectively. But it is possible that we may want to make this require some kind of basic whitelisting or depend on the uploader's key or something, so that we're not effectively saying that any Debian developer gets to upload an object which can get signed by Debian's Secure Boot key, because that would be quite a large exposure. The compromise we have in Ubuntu today is that any binary upload that is going to go through signing requires it does require button push sign off, and we just check that it matches. That is something that we've signed before, basically, in the same kind of way.
I mean,
We know what it is.
we can very, very easily make new queue processing over on a real the shim if you want to think. That would probably be facilitated. Although we could run a bit of also in that.
So, are you saying that's something you can work with Colin to make happen?
We need to talk to the region about it, I guess.
Okay. The other important piece is actually having a Debian key, which we do not have today. Tolef, I think you said a little earlier that you wanted to have an HSM for this, if it's
Yeah, we want
possible.
to have that anyway, just for purposes.
Is that something that you have hardware for at the moment? I mean, and if not, what's the lead time?
I think we have the hardware. I would need to check. There's also, it would probably also then be on a different host than the master itself, so we would need to make that protocol run, basically.
One thing about the HSMs, when we looked into this in Fujitsu, we found that there were basically none on the market that had completely free drivers, which is why we ended up using smart cards. Is that your experience, or is that just not that much of a concern?
I have one here, which
Excellent.
has free drivers
That's great.
embedded.
Okay.
So I'm not sure it actually supports everything we want to, so I would need to make sure it does that.
Yeah.
We basically just need an RSA 2048 key for this purpose.
Yeah.
But specifically 2048.
Is there like any reason we can just use it? Like we can just use a smart contract, I guess.
We can. Actual smart cards are kind of finicky and
Yeah.
break and stuff.
I use YubiKey.
Yeah.
I think that's a smart card.
Yeah,
It's fine.
the rest of this bag is basically I know the upstream people quite well, given I also maintain packages of Debian and part of the upstream team and so on. So
Tell us, are you effectively volunteering to research and make sure that the HSM is acquired?
yeah, I'll make sure that happens.
And then you said there was a second piece which was setting this up so it can be detached from FTP master.
Yeah, we probably don't want that running on FTP master directly, partially to limit the attack surface. So the machine it would be running on would probably not be an i36 machine at all.
Would that be something you'd also be doing?
Yeah, I would need to check the exact status there, but yeah, I can make the DSA side of that happen.
Okay.
recommended as secure boot with the mainline grub?
It's essentially the patch set which is in Ubuntu today, or sorry, in Debian in fact. So this consists of the Linux UEFI module, which is basically straight from iPad with a couple of tweaks. And I also added a patch to cause the Linux and init.rd commands to automatically chain through to that, so you don't have to fiddle about the config file.
Is this different than the ones that SUSE is using? They have a chain loader patch.
I don't know what's in SUSE. It's essentially the same as what's in Fedora with Hotspot. So do you have the automatic chaining of Linux to Linux to target?
No.
Okay. You probably should.
Yeah.
It's much nicer.
So should they not probably just go upstream? Go.
Yeah, but
So it's been a little bit controversial there to at least the upstream is not very keen on those. I think the most practical answer for the time being is a standard and broadly agreed
I
process.
can speak to some people. I think the concern Grub upstream have is strongly linked to assumptions about the FSF's desires on this front, and I think if this can be made clear as the only way this actually does anything is to guarantee that there's user control keys.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily going to be a problem long term, but there's going to be some discussion about that and figure out whether there is a way to determine an FSF-wide policy, well, a wide policy for that kind of thing.
Do you have folks from FSF here? Is that something that you can pull in for that discussion?
John Sullivan's around.
He's right here.
Okay.
He was just talking.
Well, we can do that after this, so we don't derail.
No, I'm not saying derail, but like if there's a plan to have a conversation, let's make that a to-do, I guess. So just we have this list of to-dos we're generating here. It seems like we got a couple concrete things for dealing with getting the Debian key hardware, the HSM pieces. And then someone's going to have to get the key. Then you mentioned that we need to get mock manager support from the shim. And there's Ubuntu stuff that does that. Is there someone who is going to take care of that? Steve will.
I'm happy to maintain the shim package. Step -1, give me a key to put in.
Okay.
No, we can get the new improvised key, but
I can, but it's not useful, and that's why I haven't uploaded it yet. If you want me to upload it with the Ubuntu key in it, sure.
I'll take it.
So this discussion you guys were just having was we need to set up a meeting with the FSF to talk about the
just to get it in the archive.
freedom piece of that. Is that what?
Merging the grub changes into the main grub.
What if any FSF? What if any objections to the FSF?
Are we actually working on getting this machine built?
No. No.
Okay.
So this would just be in Debian.
It would be more convenient not to be in too much of the bad old days where everybody had a gigantic grub patch set in every distro that was kind of ad hoc copied around. That's not really very satisfactory, but it doesn't block us immediately. One useful thing that Grub Upstream did do in response to in response to things like this was implementing its own verification layer, so you can do gcrypt-based signing of Grub modules, and it might well be nice to integrate that so that we don't have to embed all of the modules that we care about in the core image, but again, not a particular blocker.
So just in terms of in interest of making a clear to-do list, what is the meeting with the FSF that you guys need to have?
Yeah, that's
It
not
sounded
a
like you
hard
didn't
blocker.
need to do that if you're not
It's
working.
out of bound. It's not a blocker on this at all.
Okay.
To try to make sure that Debian and the FSF are vaguely aligned on what we're doing and not doing with hardware enablement level support for UEFI Secure Boot. So that's
And whether basing these patches upstream is practical.
yeah.
Are there any considerations for downstream distros that do not recompile all of Debian, but ship parts of Debian on CDs for recovery purposes?
You're going to either have to ship the same kernel as Debian, or you're going to have to also rebuild grub and shim.
Okay.
And then
Well,
finally,
use it as how does that work? I mean, I know you're not lawyers, but how does that work if like you're using like someone else's, like a signed shim that's signed by Microsoft?
As long as
in
you
your own
but shim
distribution?
itself is not GPL, so there's no problem there. Grub is, but because it's used in combination with shim, it's always possible for the user to replace it with one they built themselves. So again, there's no problem.
That's the
There's no
critical
GPL issue.
So, like if I wanted to use someone else's Microsoft signed shim in my distribution,
Yeah.
I can do that?
Yeah, you'll also have to use their kernel and their grub.
or they're signing
You'll have to use their signed packages.
Well, no, I mean like Ubuntu's now and the one you released a while ago,
Yeah.
you can do whatever you want.
If you mod it not
only
without
with-
end user involvement.
right, exactly. If you want it to be turnkey, if you don't want the user to have to set up their own machine on your key in order to boot your distribution, then you need a little bit more.
I'm booting, it's either yours or the Ubuntu one
That's
that I'm
only-
booting a 32-bit kernel that I compiled myself.
The Ubuntu thing only works because today we boot unsigned kernels after
Okay.
after the
Exit
exit of services call.
Okay.
Does it just be?
Yes, that's Pollock's HSM.
That's why it's a hardware. Hard to break.
I suppose vector kernels will be signed as well, just like regular kernels.
Yeah. Now, are we talking about shipping a Microsoft signed shim with Ubuntu?
It's already been
That's
done.
what we did.
We're already doing that?
That's what we did. Yeah, it's not exactly pretty. You're dependent on an external and not always friendly entity. It means that in order to upgrade a particular piece of software, we basically need a sign-off from Microsoft, which nobody is very comfortable with. On the other hand, the alternative is a long and protracted process of trying to set up a CA and getting that into enough actual hardware that real users will be using so that they can boot our systems. We did explore the possibility of signing with two keys, signing with Microsoft's key and with one that we operated ourselves. That runs afoul of various firmware not actually supporting that.
But not Debian wouldn't do, right?
Wouldn't do.
Ship a Microsoft signed shim?
Yes. What alternative does it
have to.
have?
What other options?
Well, I mean, encourage people to use self-signed keys and
but
automate that.
But how are you going to put the installer?
You need to bootstrap it.
If you buy a piece of computer off the shelf, it only will trust the Microsoft key. So you either have to talk people into figuring out the obscure UI that's different on each hardware, or you have to
I've been through a lot of them. Yeah.
Right. So the point for me is not does it suck that we have to rely on Microsoft for this? Yes, it does suck. But I think it's more important that we not make the process of installing a free operating system on modern firmware be a process that involves typing in a long string of hex digits into your firmware setup screen before you can even start. The effect of that is going to be turning off lots of people from free software.
Sure.
And I don't see that as something that actually meets our long-term goals. I'm not comfortable with all of the ways we have to get there, but as long as we're still building the actual software ourselves and the only involvement
from Microsoft is a signature that we can verify refers to the same code, then I think it's basically acceptable.
This is actually really good for my certain use case, which is we release a live Debian live boot distribution, which would be great to have Microsoft key in there.
So, from what I understand from our to-do list here, the uploading of the shim mock manager, the updating of the grub package to be signed by the monolith UEFI, and the kernel team change that will be the uploading of kernel images that are signed. Those are all pending on these DAC changes.
Yeah.
And all of those are relatively easy things to do. They're just simple package changes and uploads. So maybe we need to, and there isn't anything else really that needs to be done that has been identified as additional tasks since the last time we talked about this. Is that correct?
Do you already have a process to acquire the key? Doesn't we know who's going to do that?
Well, presumably it's going to be DSA that's going to acquire the key.
Well, something else we hadn't discussed is about whether this locking down things in the kernel really through secure boot.
Do you want to talk about what that?
Done a lot of work on.
So the brief summary is that in a secure boot world, for meaningful security, you need to distinguish between the root and the kernel in terms of privileges. It should know, in the past, it was straightforward for root to modify the kernel in various ways. And there was no particularly strong reason to prevent that, because at worst, they could always edit the kernel on disk and reboot into a new modified kernel. Secure boot prevents that, and so as a result, there's an incentive to lock the kernel down such that it's not possible to modify the running kernel even if you're root, which means checking for signatures on modules. It means not allowing root to modify the kernel through any debug interfaces or through devmem, or for root to be able to control PCI devices directly through their resource regions. So various things, also kexec. It's really easy to use kexec to modify the running kernel. You can jump back into the first kernel from the second kernel. It's not like you actually have to kill user space to do this. There's a set of patches which may eventually get upstream. I spent a while doing that, and then Linus said something that would contravene the code of conduct here, were I to repeat it. And now Casecook has taken over trying to get that upstream. But right now it's an external patch set that Debian would probably want to take responsibility for.
Are we in any way actually obligated, based on any real statement made from Microsoft, to do that?
No, but if your kernel can be used to subvert the security of other operating systems, then you will probably be blacklisted. There is not actually anything other than a bunch of typing stopping someone from using kexec for Windows.
Yeah, I know that. But I mean, right now, the current state.
Do the words say this? No. The words assume that you're not stupid.
Right, but what I mean is, Ubuntu is currently distributing binaries that would allow for that, no?
You would have to speak to Ubuntu's lawyers. I can't speak on their behalf. I would say this is a really bad idea.
Okay.
So is there a question about including this patch set in Debian that you wanted to discuss, or it's just something that needs to be done and noted as the details of it?
Well, including the patch set seems relatively uncontroversial. I think the question is, are we going to turn it on by default when booted via secure boot? And
what would be the point otherwise?
I meant as
if it's optional, then it has no effect, right?
I mean, it would obviously not be optional in signed kernels. The question is, what do we do with it in other cases?
I think that's a detail that can be sorted out.
Right.
It's not immediately important.
It sounds like this is definitely not blocking anything else.
Right. We have 1 minute left. The blocker for everything is getting a key organized. Is that something that a single person from DSA can do? Does it require getting several people together? Does it?
So the process is basically we generate the key and then submit a certificate request to Microsoft. Or like
No, the process is that we generate a key of
sign
the
it.
appropriate form, which is then embedded in the shim package, which we submit for signing by Microsoft.
Okay.
They do not
So we
see
generate a
key or
key,
anything.
we decide where you store the key, you generate the key, you create your own self-signed certificate, and we put that certificate in the shim package.
Yes.
And then we submit the
Hang on,
shim
but
package for
does-
signing.
but
Shim binary.
hang on, how do you do the signing request? Is that like an SSL?
That requires you to get an EV cert from
Yes.
a CA.
And then you upload the binary through a web form that is written in Silverlight.
Yes, using a Windows laptop that you have sitting around for that purpose.
Every other part of this you
Does
don't
it-
need Windows for, but you need
Where
Windows
does,
currently to
where
upload.
does it come in? Is it a class?
It's an EV code signing, well.
It's an EV code signing certificate that's available from 2 vendors right now. You use that to sign the uploads, you do not use that for anything else.
And then they replace that with it.
You use that to sign the, which format?
You sign a cabinet,
Cab
which
file.
then
Yeah,
contains your binary. They extract it from the cabinets.
Silly question. Does the existing setup allow for being signed with multiple keys
No.
and not just by Microsoft?
So the setup does.
In theory,
you get
but
the
not in practice.
binary back from Microsoft, you add your own keys in addition to the Microsoft key.
Right.
And then about 10 to 15% of machines refuse to boot.
Right, because it was not in the
Yeah,
UEFI
sure.
spec.
It was not usefully in the UEFI spec.
Isn't that what SUSE is doing? Because they have the SUSE key on the HP machines?
Yeah, that's for HP preloads only, not for any other situation, I believe now.
Yeah, obviously if you're preloading it on a particular vendor's firmware, then you can make sure that it works there.
Yeah. Okay, so DSA needs to purchase an EV cert, generate the key and the self-signed pieces that then would be passed on to Steve to jam into the shim package that would then be uploaded via Windows.
At what point is,
Is that-
what stage in this does the shim get packed into a signed cabinet?
We upload the shim source to Debian, get that through new, well, I guess we're not doing source uploads, either we upload a binary, maybe we want to use that for this package so that the binaries are always built on the build piece. And we get we get through binary new and we have the shim binary package we extract, well, whoever controls the certificate, whoever controls the key that has the EV cert, extracts the executable, puts it in a cab, signs the cab, and all of those steps can be done on Linux.
Yeah.
Then you submit it to Microsoft through the website, which has to be done on Windows.
Has anyone tested to see if that site works with the Silverlight compatible thing built on bottom?
Moonlight, I don't think works with any current set of libraries able to chips.
I kind of figured it, thought I'd ask.
It also, in our experience, can't even be run in a virtualized instance of Windows.
Oh, you're kidding.
What?
So far as we've been able to determine, our IS team has not
That
been able.
particular Silverlight application doesn't, because Silverlight in general seems to.
For the purposes of submissions, it does not appear to work.
Wow.
So we can't use.
Okay, that could be ineptitude with Windows on the part of our IT team. It's not exactly a skill we select for.
Okay, so the DSA obtains an EV cert and generates the key and the self-signed cert. Is that clear that DSA is going to do that, or should that be a key manager role? Or is that in dispute? Or is that what DSA?
Really have another.
DSA would de facto be in control of the key due to managing the hardware it's connected to.
So it
I
makes
don't see
sense
any reason to have a
for it to
separate
be
role
DSA.
for that.
So
Do we
then
need
someone from
a-
DSA would also be doing the extraction and signing.
Is there any value to the two-level setup that we have in Ubuntu if we are effectively having the key permanently online rather than the edges? So we use at the moment we have a two-level setup so that we have something which is FIPS compliant but not, approximately FIPS compliant anyway, but not online. And an operational key which we can use to routinely sign grub uploads.
Right, so I mean, the
do we
reason-
need that?
My understanding of the motivation for that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember it being that we were interested in being able to revoke particular signatures we've done without having to go through Microsoft. The actual implementation of that is somewhat questionable due to the fact that we don't have the same process for revocation propagation that Microsoft has.
All right. But in theory, at least, we should probably do the same thing.
I don't know. We haven't used it. It hasn't been useful to date. And part of that is the fact that we cannot write to DBX means that we cannot. That the way you get around this is by simply grabbing an older version of shim or whatever.
So we can certainly provide you with the procedure that we used to generate all of our keys. I don't know of anything at all that's
It sounds pretty straightforward, but I mean, when you already have it, then it's good to just copy that.
It was sadly not especially straightforward involved in itself, but yeah.
So, we'll get that to Toph. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you make sure, as the DSA person here, to do this insert key piece and all the data stuff? Okay, great. Put your name down so that it's stuck with it.
And we're happy with steps beyond that. I think we have an understanding of what's needed and we've got names next to all the tasks.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Are there deadlines for anything? Yes. Are we expecting this all to get in for Jesse?
That would be nice.
It would be nice, but of course it's going to depend on Microsoft deciding.
It would be sad if we didn't. It would be nice.
Yeah, quite.
Let's do it. Things need to start moving, and we're going to get this done. So I want to make sure that if we actually think we're going to get it done for Jesse,
so our target deadline is Jesse,
which means that the DSE piece needs to be done within the month.
Yeah. Are we happy with that?
Well, yeah, not big.
Within a month.
Yes. but the most closest
So by 20th of September, we will have it.
That should be good. And the other bits and pieces can go through new and all that even before then.
Yeah. Sorry, that was nice.
Yeah. It may not be useful, but at least it then means we're not then delayed on anything else.
Okay, so goal date 20th September. Okay.
And then very shortly after that, we should then be able to get stuff like working sign work.
Yeah. I will be using source of the updates for relevant.
Sure. And once that filters through, very shortly after, we get stuff like signed CD image or signed boot from CD images and that kind of thing. And clearly I commit to making sure that works. You've already done this anyway before, so
we can work through that. There are tedious.
Exactly. It's just a simple matter of process.
Plan on putting the sign panel back into the office.
Yes.
Yes.
So the way that we do this right now, and I can't think of any other way, you need it in a dev in order to be able to support upgrades.
Yeah.
So this means that that we have to do 2 stage uploads.
Yeah.
So we need to upload. We upload Grub 2. That's signed by the DAC machinery. Later on, we upload Grub 2 signed, which downloads the signed thing from the archive, verifies it against the keys it expects, and it stuffs that into a dev and uploads it.
Yes.
And the same will happen for Shim.
And Shim works differently because you're waiting for it to come back from Microsoft, and also because we need to verify that Microsoft actually signed the thing we asked them to sign. But
We do that at home.
but yes, functionally. it's-
But basically, sign Shim will be in the dev in the office.
Yes.
Yes.
It sounds like the DAC pieces that you need to work with doing testing in the environment should probably happen in parallel while the keep doing
They
that.
can.
We don't get blocked out.
They can. Unfortunately, the shape, while we use entirely different archive management software and into the shape of that particular piece of it was inspired by DAC and is quite similar.
All right. I guess we gotta go. Thanks, everybody. Pretty awesome. Jesse.
Oh, Jesse.